But highly likely, of course, that this is a symbolic number, meaning a symbolic group. There are a variety of ways we can break this number down into other numbers we've looked at, most of which involve the squaring of 12. Right? 12 times 12 being 144 times, the square of 10 times 10, the square of 1,000, right? There's so many different ways you can break 144,000 down. But when you break it down, it breaks down into numbers we've seen in other places that emphasize perfection or completeness. And some people have even suggested by having it be the square of 12, that it's the 12 tribes times the 12 apostles, right? So that's where the 12 times 12 coming from. At some point I think you might be digging a little bit too far, but the idea here of a symbolic number meant to suggest completion. But some people have suggested that there are a couple of things that we should recognize about this. I'll get back to what I was going in a different direction. First of all, it is out of every tribe of the people of Israel. Right? So they're sealed, 144,000 sealed out of the tribe of Israel. So if this is a literal number, and we're taking this very literally, know who it applies to: Israelites. And also, when you go into chapter 14, two other things are mentioned about them. First, they're all men. So no women end up in the 144,000. If this is a literal, we take this literally. Secondly, they're all virgins. So no married people, no women. So if some people want to take this as a literal number about things that are going to happen in the future, there are a couple of passages that complicate that a little bit. And so that's one thing to say, maybe this isn't literal, but more symbolic. The other thing, of course, to think about is this only the martyrs? Because one of the things we see here is a difference between, it's kind of presented as a difference between this first group, verses 1 through 8, and a different group, 9 through 17. Now, ultimately, I think there are just kind of two ways of seeing the same group. But some people would like to make this distinction between this first group and the second group. Why would God only protect the martyrs? From chapter 6, right? I saw the souls underneath the throne, and they cry out, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you not judge and avenge our blood upon those who inhabit the earth?" Right? It doesn't seem like God would only protect a certain group of people, in the sense of some Christians. It seems likely that it's more symbolic for everyone. Because, of course, the other thing to think about is if this is literal people of Israelite heritage, or literal Jews, are we seeing a preference for Jews over Gentiles? Because verse 9 talks about this great multitude from all tribes, people, languages. So if we take this first part literally, they're the ones getting sealed. The Israelites, the Jews, not the Gentiles. Yet, of course, Peter says in Acts chapter 10, verse 34, when he meets Cornelius, "I understand now that God is no respecter of persons." So it doesn't seem likely that this is specifically Israelites, Jews, that are talked about. It's symbolically using Israel to talk about God's people. There's something else that's rather interesting when you think about it from this passage, and that has to do with the way the 12 tribes are presented. So in Revelation chapter 7, this is the order of the 12 tribes. Now on the surface, okay, but when you start to think about it, why this order? There's some odd things about how these 12 tribes are presented in Revelation. I don't want you necessarily to get down this 12 order. I'll tell you that there's two things that I want you to know about what's odd about here, and so that's the only things you need to focus on. So you don't necessarily need to know the order here. If you go back to Genesis and read through Genesis, and you look at the children of Jacob, right, and as they're born, this is the list, right? It starts with Reuben and ends with Benjamin. But we have here Judah placed first when he's actually fourth in birth order. Right? He was the fourth child born. So first of all, we say, okay, why is Judah placed first? That's where Christ came from. Right? And so it's, okay, maybe this is ordered this way because he's emphasizing this is the birth of Christ. It's the kingly tribe. Right? Judah was placed over his brothers, and so Judah's placed first. So that one seems to be pretty easily handled, right? Because that one comes out pretty easy. But as you make a comparison between these two lists otherwise, you say, okay, there's no comparison here in the orders. And really, when you go back to the Old Testament and you look at anywhere the tribes are listed, there's all sorts of different lists. One commentary I was reading said there's 20 different lists of the tribes. Like, I mean, you'll read about it as they inherit the land, and you'll read about it in the beginning of Chronicles. I did not look this up, I'll be honest with you. So I'm basing this on what I've read. None of the lists in the Old Testament match this list. Right? So there's no list in the Old Testament that say it matches this list. But when you start to look at this list and this list, or even comparing the Revelation 7 list and the tribes as they inherit the land. So this is like if you went from north to south, like took a map, right, and went from north to south of Israel. This is in general the direction you would come, right? When you look at this list, there's a couple things that are odd. Because, let's go back a second here. In the birth order, right, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. When you look at this list, there's no Dan. But there is a Manasseh. When you look at the tribe list, you say, okay, Manasseh, but there's still no Dan, right? There's no Ephraim, and instead Joseph shows up. Because in the tribes, Joseph's sons had to take his position, and Levi didn't have a specific region. Levi took cities. So Dan and Ephraim are left off of this list in Revelation 7. So what's John doing? Is he just trying to guess? I used to know the 12 tribes. Let me write them down and see what I get. Or might there be a reason why it's ordered this way? So the one thing I want you to know about the order is that Dan and Ephraim are missing. So there might be a question on the exam about, in the list of the 12 tribes, which tribes are missing? Dan and Ephraim. Right? So know that. The second thing is why? Well, when you look in the Old Testament and look at the ways Dan and Ephraim are talked about, they are often very closely connected with idolatry. So Ephraim kind of serves as a substitution for the 10 tribes. Like if you look at the book of Hosea, especially there, right? He's talking to Ephraim, but he's talking to the 10 tribes. And so Ephraim connected with idolatry. Dan as well connected with idolatry. And so Dan is removed, Levi comes in, Ephraim is removed, and Joseph comes in. And so probably what it has to do with is that John is presenting a group of Israel that excludes those two tribes that accommodated to the culture around them. Much like the Christians in Asia are being tempted to do. And so that's probably why we have this order in this place, even though it's quite different than the other ones we see before in the Old Testament. Questions about that? I know it's kind of a little complicated there, confusing. All right, so we finish with verse 8 and now turn to verse 9, where there's this break between John has seen the stealing of the 144,000. But then he sees in verse 9 a great multitude. In fact, a great multitude that no one could count. So in one case we have a group that is given a definitive number, right? 144,000. Another group that doesn't have a definitive number. No one can count this group. Now, when you hear this idea of innumerable descendants, or I should kind of tip it off, innumerable people serving God, what might it tip you off to? All right, descendants, but descendants of Abraham, right? So one of the promises, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, right? And so I think one of the things here is that it's reflecting this promise to Abraham. The other promise I think that is represented here as well is that seed promise, right? That the seed of Abraham was going to bless all the nations, right? And so there's an innumerable multitude from all peoples, tribes, languages, nations. And so I think this is kind of a visual representation of the completion of that seed promise, right? Your descendants will be innumerable, and you, all the nations of the earth, will be blessed. But one of the questions to ask here is this a different group from the 144,000? The 144,000 are all Israelites. The great multitude includes Gentiles, right? Because they from all tribes, all nations, peoples, and lands. The 144,000 is a specific number. This number is, right, a great multitude no one can count. So our options are to think of this as two separate groups, or to think of it as two ways to talk about the same group. I tend to favor that it is two ways to talk about the same group, and here's why. As we think about it, the first picture presents us with God's people as the faithful remnant of Israel, the true Israel. You think back to chapters 2 and 3, there's a couple of the churches to which Jesus said, he talks about the synagogue of Satan, those that say they are Jews, but are not. And they're troubling them. And so I think that contrast, it works. But as a flip side, the second picture, the great multitude, reflects kind of the universal reach of the church. Right? So there's a true Israel, but it's a true Israel that's made up of all nations and tribes. Another thing that could be reflected here as well is that by looking at this group with that number, 144,000, we see that emphasis on God knowing each and every person. Right? He knows the number. He knows who are His. The second picture being, and that number is really, really big. Right? Truly, it's really, really big. The other thing that's interesting of this is the way in which some people have drawn a parallel between the two depictions here and the depiction of Jesus as both lion and lamb. So the lion, of course, power, nobility, victory. And if we accept that view of that 144,000 being God's army, but the lamb, that suffering perseverance, we see in that second picture. Plus, he is the lion from the tribe of Judah, but the lamb ransoms saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. Right? And so these parallels people pointed out, and I think there's some good ones there that are pointed out. What's also interesting here that might serve as a parallel is where these people are. They are standing before the throne. Now looking back at the end of chapter 6 ends with a question. What's the question at the end of chapter 6?
The great day of bitter wrath has come, and who can stand?
Right? Who's able to stand on the day of the wrath of God and the Lamb? These people. Right? These are the people that are able to stand on the day of the wrath of God and the Lamb. So maybe that's the answer to that question. Right? It doesn't explicitly say it, but the fact that John writes they are standing before the throne suggests, of course, that they are the ones that have been protected. They are robed in white, and we've talked about purity and righteousness. And they are presented there with palm branches. Why palm branches? That seems like just an obscure, out-of-the-way symbol. But might there be some connection with that? Something that we could say, this is probably referring to something else. Yeah, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Right? And so there's that connection there. And so the robed in white probably suggests, the purity, the righteousness, the palm branches suggesting victory, triumph, connected with the triumphal entry of Jesus in Jerusalem. And they are crying out, again in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God and to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb. So, what does it mean by saying salvation belongs to our God? Just looking at that phrase, what do you think that means?
It's his to give.
All right, so in one sense, salvation is God's to give. It's got to come from God. What's another way we can understand that phrase? Okay, yeah, that God is the one who is totally responsible for salvation. We owe everything to God, right? God is the one who works out salvation. So we have all sorts of things that are connected here, right? God is the one who offers salvation, provides for salvation, determines what saves and what does not, right? Provides the means of salvation. And even is the one who determines who's saved and lost. I don't mean in the sense of predestination, but of judgment. Right? God makes the judgment. And this person is saved.